Good morning, everybody. You doing well? Good. We are so delighted this morning to have a very, very special guest with us. Many of you got to hear her share this past Friday night. This is Cheryl Baker. Cheryl is a longtime member of Saddleback Church in California. And just over 31 years ago, her husband John had a vision for a ministry called Celebrate Recovery. and together, they made that happen at Saddleback, not dreaming of the global expanse of that ministry that has taken place today. It is phenomenal what all is taking. In fact, many of you may not realize that every Friday night we have over 350 people here. It is church on Friday night. I mean, from everything from preschool through adults. And so if you've never had a chance to take a look at Celebrate Recovery, please join us sometime on a Friday night. Well, now, Cheryl, at the age, a year older than she was last year, she has continued to follow God's call on her life as that call has evolved into what is now, based upon the experience that she's had with the tragic loss of her husband John just over 2 years ago in February, to enter into a ministry seeking to help others in the grief process, to help others with their grief. And so I'm delighted, Cheryl, that you're with us today, and thank you so much for being willing to share this time with us this morning. Very much. She has been a busy person this entire weekend, and so thanks for including this as a part of that time. Well, Cheryl, many don't realize that only about a third of those that are involved in Celebrate Recovery are involved in recovering from drug or alcohol addiction.
Correct.
And I know that alcohol recovery was what John experienced. But that was not your issue when you guys started CR. Yet you say in your testimony that you were taken by surprise when you realized that you needed recovery. Exactly. Would you mind sharing with us exactly kind of how that came about?
Well, I wanted to support John in the ministry, and he was so excited about it. And so I was going to help him with Celebrate Recovery so that he would stay sober. Now, if anybody's here been in Celebrate Recovery, you know right now that I was a codependent, but I was not aware of that yet. And so just the fact that I thought I was going to help him was sort of the first issue there. And that also I was just going to help a whole bunch of people because, I had it all together. So about the third open chair meeting, it didn't take long, about the third open chair meeting, I kept hearing women give stories that were so similar to mine. And many raised in a very dysfunctional home, and they were really great about sharing that. And then I realized that I didn't want to call my mom an alcoholic because that seemed disrespectful and dishonoring, but I realized that she was. So the realization that I had been raised by an alcoholic and I had married one, and there were some signs that I should be careful about marrying John, but I did anyway, thinking that everything would be okay, made me realize I needed to start taking a look at myself. And so this program no longer was just for John and helping him stay sober, but now I had to take a look at myself.
That's wonderful. Yeah, that's been the experience that many of our folks have encountered as well in the process of realizing really that we all need recovery.
Absolutely.
That recovery is really just that process of sanctification, becoming what Christ has created us to be, that the sin, the hurts, habits, and hang-ups in our lives that have damaged in the past. Well, in spite of the fact that grief is something that every one of us are going to encounter sometime in life, it's still one of the last things that people like to talk about,
right.
And I know you know that. In your testimony, you quote C.S. Lewis, who, after the death of his wife, wrote, "No one ever told me that grief felt so much like fear." I think that's something that catches a lot of people off guard. Would you explain what that means and what your experience with that has been?
Sure. I never, even though John was going through cancer, the doctor was very optimistic, and he was actually in remission, so I didn't think much about what life was going to be like without him, and I think most of us don't. So he died suddenly. He went for a walk, and I was trying to help him up, and I had my arms around him, and he passed away in my arms. So everything changed in that instant, like it does for most of us who talk about grief. but I couldn't accept that my life has changed so suddenly. I immediately started, I didn't know this was happening, but I was having heart palpitations at night and was waking up in sweat. And I went to the doctor and she said, "You're having panic attacks." I was never prone to anything like that. My kids were like, "Please don't be so afraid, Mom. Everything's going to be okay." But you couldn't tell me that. I just was continually fearful. And as I look back on it, I think I was afraid because I didn't really know who I was without John. We'd been married for 51 years. We'd done everything in Celebrate Recovery together. It was a part of us. We'd raised our kids together, our grandkids. I didn't know who I was without him. And then, unfortunately, when you're grieving, people treat you very differently. So the fear keeps going. You're feeling at loss and no identity. People are treating you differently. You don't know what the future holds. And so we get afraid. And it was friends that just kept showing up for me that helped me get through the fear. And I went through, for those of you not a part of Celebrate Recovery, there's a step that you go through where you look at your past. And I started looking, I did that inventory, it's called, and I put down the things that were happening to me after John passed to try to figure out what was happening. And I saw the patterns. I saw why I was afraid, particularly the coroner said that he probably had fallen as a result of the walk, and I had talked him into going for the walk. So I was fearful that I was the cause of him dying. So when I looked at the form and then talked to some people about it, I got through a short inventory, and that helped me start to embrace the fear.
Thank you, Cheryl. Yeah. You've talked about struggling with something that's very common for many who are in grief, and you affectionately refer to it as half-grief brain.
Yes, yes.
But would you tell us what that's about?
I kind of wish if you don't hear anything I say this morning, you remember when you're dealing with somebody in that half-grief brain. We just can't make decisions, and yet the decisions are flooding in, and we can't think, and I think I speak for most of us, we're frightened and we can't make decisions. And I've recently learned there's a physical reason for that. Your body is actually attempting to have it become normal that person is no longer there, because that person's been with you, and your brain is actually making new neurons for this. So your brain is just not fully functioning, and yet people are coming at you, asking you things all of the time. What do you want to eat? I don't feel like eating. Well, you're supposed to eat, but I don't want to. Those kinds of things, those little decisions you just can't make. But when I discovered that it wasn't just me and my age that was having trouble making decisions, my kids were having trouble, my son-in-law, my daughter-in-law, we were all having trouble making decisions, we started to laugh about it. And then once we could laugh about it, it gave us permission to say, I just can't make that decision right now, but I'll think about it, I'll get back to you, which we learned to do at work, but we don't learn to do in the time of grief. Even picking out photos for the memorial, those are decisions that have to be made. But allowing ourselves permission to not have to move on some of those decisions is a game changer.
Well, thank you. I know again, that so many people wrestle with that very thing in the midst of their grief, and so that I know that encourages lots of folks. For
I
sure.
hope so.
John's death brought a lot of unwanted changes in your life, as it does for anyone who loses a loved one like that. Would you give us some examples of what some of those changes were that you had to experience, had to go through at that time?
I think the biggest changes after 51 years, being alone in the house, cooking for yourself, watching the dog grieve even, were changes, and changes in relationships started happening right away. I had some people that didn't really want to hear about my sadness, but then God provided me people that I would not have thought would be there for me, and they were the ones that, now my step-study sisters were there for me, I would have counted on them, but there were some people that I thought would be there for me, but they didn't like to see me sad, didn't know what to say, but then God provided me these beautiful people that just said, I'll be there with you. they didn't ask me what I wanted because I didn't know. They just said, we're going to be here with you as you journey through your grief. So I was provided with a circle of friends that I could call. I could say what I needed and would be there for me, but I really didn't even have to say what I needed. They almost kind of knew what I was going through because they were safe people. And the change, one of the biggest changes was figuring out who was safe in my grief and who was not safe in my grief, and figuring out who would listen and who didn't want to. I think that was the biggest change, is the relationships.
Were there any particular changes that you would classify as most unexpected?
Yes. There were a couple of friends who were what you consider best friend category. And about 6 months after he passed away, they sort of broke contact. And so we're grieving, and then the relationships are changing. We don't know who we are, and we're dealing with a half-grief brain. Those relationships are critical. That would be the best advice I would give for somebody who wants to reach out to someone who's grieving, is be there. And the second thing I learned is, even if I don't feel like I'm that person's first line of defense, is I'm going to step into it anyway and say, I'll be here for you, check up on that person, and be there. Because I know now that they are going to lose some of the relationships that they're counting on. And I've learned from other widows that's exactly what happens. We don't know why it happens, we just know that it does.
Well, thank you so much, Cheryl. Many of us here today may not really fully understand what Celebrate Recovery is all about, but I think it would help us if you would talk a little bit about what it was that you learned in CR over all those years that helped you the most in that grief process.
Well, CR starts off all the time with realize I'm not God. And for a codependent who likes to take charge, that was the first thing that came to my mind, is I'm not God, but he still loves me in this circumstance, which as Christians most of us know, but I think we really internalize that so much in Celebrate Recovery, because we're dealing so much with our past and bringing things up that are sometimes hard to deal with. I think that was the first thing, was going through those principles. I went through those principles about 3 or 4 months after he passed and did that inventory sheet I'd mentioned, so that I could sort of get a handle on what was happening, and that was very helpful. And then the other part was the safe people I talked about. I don't know, without Celebrate Recovery, if I would have known how to determine who was safe for me and who wasn't, and to trust God to allow some of the people to leave while he brought new people in. That Celebrate Recovery really helped me. And then I always did feel safe at Celebrate Recovery, but I didn't want to go there necessarily, because every time I went to Celebrate Recovery, I saw John. He was every part of Celebrate Recovery, so that was hard. And I started sitting in the back, but then my CR friends would just be there for me, and I knew that I had people to count on. But those principles, working through that. Another big part of Celebrate Recovery is asking for forgiveness and giving it, making amends and giving forgiveness, and that's critical here. And another piece of advice I would give, if anybody wants to know, is if you have not served somebody well who's been grieving, just tell them. Just say, I'm sorry I wasn't there for you, so what can I do now? The grief can last for years. So if you weren't there the first year, there's still plenty of opportunity to be there for that person. Giving amends and offering forgiveness were huge in grief, which is something I did not expect. I thought I was going to be in a bubble since I was suffering from the grief, and that I'd be protected from everything else. And I don't know what makes us think that, but I thought that. So when the relationship started changing, to be able to say, I forgive you, whether they come back in the relationship or not, I've done my part, it frees me. I say I'm sorry for what I've done, and I forgive you, then it gives me the opportunity to open myself up to other people.
Wow. Anything else that you can think of that you learned over those years that has been the best help as far as ministry to people in the midst of their grief?
I think to not be afraid to say the person's name. Somebody came up to me Friday night and told me a story about John I'd never heard. And that ministered to me. That was a wonderful thing, and people they think if they bring up that person's name, it'll make you sad. But that's just the opposite. You want to hear stories about what they've done or how they've affected you. So that was something that I didn't know before John passed. And for friends whose husbands or people in their lives passed, I didn't know that they'd want to hear about them and keep their memory alive. So that young man, I don't know if he's here today or not, but that was very helpful. And I think he felt awkward telling me the story, and I was like, but that's a highlight of the trip. So I think I'd like us to just start talking about grief more. It is a natural order of life, and we don't talk about it. We kind of sweep it under the rug. It makes us uncomfortable. So part of what I'm trying to do now is make it something that we can talk about. You can talk about with your loved ones what you want, what you don't want, and just make it a part of everyday life so it's not so scary and not one of those stigma things. We need to be able to talk about it more freely.
That's wonderful. Yeah, absolutely. Well, I know that ultimately finding new hope and a renewed purpose for your life has been huge for you.
Yes.
Would you share with us how that happened for you in your life, in your walk?
The first thing that happened was that Rick Warren and Kay came to see me about a week after John passed because I didn't want to see anybody. And we were all, of course, crying. But I said to Rick, I'm so grateful that you've taught us that there's a purpose to our pain. I don't know what this purpose is yet, but I have hope that will be revealed to me, that I'm going to be able to take this pain and do something with it. So I was able to thank him for that. And then after I went to the first Celebrate Recovery Summit, I learned that there were several women who had just recently lost their husbands. So during that first holiday season, Christmas, Thanksgiving, I got a hold of them and asked if they wanted to get on a Zoom call and just talk just long enough to get us through the holidays of 2021. And we started able to share things that you feel badly if somebody says, what's something you miss? And you say, I miss him taking out the trash, because that sounds so mundane, but we literally will cry for weeks doing a job that they used to do because it's such a reminder he's not there. And other widows totally understood that, so we could cry and laugh about it and feel safe. So we went to the following summit and started talking because we were all doing better. What are we going to do now? We've progressed. We're Celebrate Recovery people. We're supposed to give back. We're supposed to share what we've learned, and we decided we would try online grief groups, because what the idea is to hook widows up with other widows so they would be talking to the same people that understood. If a mom has lost a child, to put her with other women that have lost children so that the grief is the same. And in a church a certain size might not have a whole group of widows or a whole group of women that have lost children, or a man's group who's lost their parent. So we put it on Zoom. And that has given me hope because of the stories I've been hearing, and it makes me feel still connected to John. His life, of course, has had a purpose to celebrate recovery, but now I'm hoping to help people that are grieving, which I feel goes back to him. I got to do this with my daughter because she was hurting so much and not being able to find a place to talk about losing her dad, so she found a group. And the stories that I've heard from her own group, because she kept saying, Mom, I can't believe it. This actually is working. This is working in our group. And we're finding hope and moving on. And that's kind of what I'm trying to do.
That's awesome. That's great. We absolutely.
Thank you. Thanks.
We appreciate you so very much. And I was just reminded this past week of 2 Corinthians 1, where the Apostle Paul says that we are to comfort others with the same comfort, God's comfort with which we have been comforted.
Right.
And thank you for epitomizing what that verse means.
That is my life verse. That's my scripture.
Anything else that you can think of that you want to share with us?
I think if anybody would have told me that I would ever start feeling better 2 years ago, I would have said absolutely not. And it almost feels disloyal to laugh or to enjoy life after such a significant person is gone. But there is hope for that, renewing relationships, starting brand new relationships, finding a purpose, enjoying people in different ways, connections, stronger connections, for instance, with my daughter, and just finding new adventures. That's one thing I try to do, is things that John would never have done, like get a horse. So we bought a horse, and I'm sure he's like, what in the world are you doing? But he would have never wanted to do that. And so that's a different thing that I enjoy, but then keeping the traditions of Christmas that he loved. So it's a little bit of both. But I do want to say, if anybody is here grieving today, to try to find people that will support you and listen to you, and that there is hope and you can move forward and you will laugh again, because it doesn't feel like that in the early days. And so I just, I'm on Facebook. You can get a hold of me if you want to and tell me your story. We could help you in any way that we can, but basically let people talk about grief. Let them have that conversation, and things will get better.
Well, thank you so very much.
All right.
And,
Thanks, Tess.
thank you.